Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the show we call Breakdown. It's our daily analysis of what went down at the Public Order Emergency Commission. That's the official examination of the Trudeau government's actions in invoking a wartime law, the Emergencies Act, to extinguish an entirely peaceful anti-mandate protest in the nation's capital that just had grown a little bit too embarrassing for Justin Trudeau. And we just wrapped up, Selene and I and William over there, and K2 behind the camera. We just wrapped up a 12-hour day.
12 hours, yeah.
12 full hours in the commission room. And
no big deal.
We're joined today by trucker lawyer Keith Wilson, just to my left here. And Keith, it was a crazy day today. We heard from the director of CSIS and then the top spy in the country, the assistant director of CSIS, and then the top intelligence analyst, I guess, in the country.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. And I'll go directly to our first clip after we set it up. But the director of CSIS, that's David Vigneault, he testified that CSIS was not investigating the convoy as a whole. They said that there were some what they call IMVEs, ideologically motivated violent extremists. That's a term I hope I never hear again. It's just so droned into your head after daylight today. But he said that they were not really investigating the convoy for any of those things. There might have been people who were attaching themselves to the convoy that were sort of on CSIS's radar, but the convoy itself was not a threat, according to CSIS.
That's right. They didn't feel they met the threshold, and their intelligence didn't support that there was anything to investigate.
Isn't that interesting? And yet, and we'll get to it in a bit, the CSIS director, David Vigneault, advised Justin Trudeau to just drop the hammer anyway.
Yeah.
I think we'll get to that in a second. Let's go to clip one. This is the CSIS director testifying that they were not investigating the convoy.
Right, but the service was not investigating the anti-public health measures movement broadly, for example, and it certainly wasn't investigating the convoy itself as a discrete topic. No. Is that right?
As was mentioned earlier, we are prevented by law to investigate protest and lawful dissent. We're not investigating the convoy itself. Our interest is to understand how that dynamic is potentially influencing individuals that were known already to CSIS, and others potentially to radicalize further and engage in potential threat-related activity. So we were not investigating the convoy.
Right.
You know, that's interesting because the CSIS Act specifically restrains CSIS from surveilling or examining lawful protests, including anti-government protests, as long as they're peaceful.
Yeah, and I mean I think we all take some comfort in that, or should, but I think we all similarly had some unease about this whole concept of ideologically motivated extremists when they were talking about the definition of that and how broad it was.
Yeah.
And it's somebody who not only believes something, but believes on it to the extent that they want to act it out and change the world around them, to have the world around them be different than it is today.
It sounds like a Christian.
I was just about to say, it sounds like religion or an environmentalist or, a scout leader.
Right.
I mean, where do we stop? It just seems and they mentioned it's a new thing. And the first time I started reading up on this.
We used to call them terrorists.
Yes, but
many definitions these days.
No, we used to accept that there's people that have different views about how the world should be,
right? And
they're entitled to stand on a street corner and tell you all about it. They're entitled to start a club, and push these views. But now it seems to be a trigger of whether or not the government gets to watch you and whether it puts you in an offside zone, which was disconcerting to hear some of it.
Yeah. And I wonder why they changed the phraseology. I think probably to make it more broad, right? Because we used to say, okay, well, that's a terrorist doing terrorist things and that's a terrorist cell. And now it's ideologically motivated violent extremists. But we've also seen how they changed the definition of violence to include inconvenience and honking.
Yes. and how people feel.
Right.
As opposed to, and that was really clear through a number of the testimony today, that they've also morphed that. I mean, we associate on an intuitive level violence to be, obviously reprehensible, but something that's physical in nature.
Right.
Right. And we've seen throughout the inquiry, starting from the very first witnesses from the city residents, that it was felt aggressions and felt violence. One of the senior police officials also talked about that. So we're getting a lot of double speak into language that is very disconcerting.
Yeah. Well, I think one of my favorite clips today, though, is clip number 2. And this was the lawyer from the JCCF examining the top security apparatus in this country and making them answer to every specific portion of Section 2 of the CSIS Act, which is the bar.
It's the test.
It's the bar. If you have to hit 4 of those or at least one of the 4.
Yeah.
But they hit none of the 4. And actually they didn't even worry about the 4th because they said it was so non-existent that they didn't even bother investigating it. You have to hit one of the 4 to initiate the Emergencies Act. And so let's go to clip 2 because it's quite astounding.
That a terrorist group was going to pretend to use an event in order to conduct a terrorist activity. Well, of course, that would be of interest to CSIS. But we are very, very conscious and aware of balancing the rights of individuals in a democracy like Canada with our own mandate and our more intrusive techniques.
Okay, Mr. Vigneault, so let's look at, we can look at A first. Based on the services assessment, there was no espionage or sabotage associated with the protest, correct?
That's correct.
So the 2A definition wasn't met?
No.
Okay. And there was no foreign interference?
We have, I think it's in our testimony that we have said that we investigated foreign interference in relation to the event, including foreign funding, and we do not see these activities amounting to a threat to the security of Canada.
So 2B wasn't met?
Yeah.
Thank you. And there wasn't any serious violence associated with the protests?
I would not say that.
Or a credible threat of serious violence?
That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at, how these events or individuals, might engage in activities that meet our threshold. This is where I was answering questions earlier about, distinction between what law enforcement would be doing in terms of serious violence versus what we would do as a CSIS under the confine of the CSIS Act.
Okay, I'll be more specific then. There were no activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada, correct?
Yes, and we've testified to that earlier. I think.
So 2C wasn't
2C was not met.
Okay, and just quickly, there was no credible threat to overthrowing our established system of government.
I can say that we have not investigated under 2D.
It's astounding because if you watch mainstream media, all you hear is that this was a seditionist plot.
Well, and this is another theme that's emerged where the law is clear, the test is clear, it's a checklist. You cannot invoke the Emergencies Act unless you can check certain boxes.
Yeah.
And the testimony from the OPP intelligence people, the RCMP, the Ottawa Police Service, the Solicitor General for the province of Ontario, senior government officials, the Deputy Attorney General or Public Safety Minister for Canada have all been the same, which is none of the tests were met. But then they proceed to say, and as we heard today from the director of CSIS, well, I recommended it anyway.
Yeah.
And that is illegal. That is an unlawful thing to do, particularly when you're talking about invoking a measure that allows the federal government to intrude into provincial jurisdiction, which they did, and strip Canadians of fundamental rights, freeze their personal bank accounts, freeze their corporate bank accounts, prevent them from meeting businesses from meeting payroll, preventing parents from paying for daycare, rent, and food.
Right. And subsequently, we found out that they were denying bank loans after the fact. Like Farm Credit Canada was guilty of that. And yeah, after the fact, that takes us to our next clip. The same CSIS director who just testified that none of the benchmarks were reached by the convoy under Section 2 of the CSIS Act. And I think that there were documents that said that we saw, I think it was February 10th, where he was saying there are no plots within the convoy. There are no serious threats within the convoy. I think he might be the only law enforcement official who uses the word violence correctly in this whole thing. But by the 13th, I think he met with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and all of a sudden things changed. And he said that it was because he received outside legal advice, but I hardly think it was outside because he got it from the Justice Department, which wanted to invoke the Emergencies Act anyway.
Well, I think the Prime Minister wanted to invoke the Emergencies Act. And he needed someone to say, okay, good idea. And we didn't learn until yesterday of the existence of that document. And this is another problem.
Right.
Since leaving the hearing room, we just got served.
Again?
Since you left the hearing room, we just got bombarded again with another large document dump from the federal government, despite the fact that half of their witnesses have already testified. The conduct of the federal government and how the commission is allowing this to happen without consequence and doing nothing to bring fairness back into the process is severely undermining the integrity and the credibility of the commission process and this whole hearing.
Right, because you're not even getting the full scope of the evidence, and you're trying to craft questions, but you can't ask questions if you don't even know what the full story is. As we were there today, you and I saw it firsthand. We're sitting behind Brendan Miller and the Freedom team, and they're getting documents dumped on them. They're getting documents that were suddenly becoming unredacted. Yeah. And then Brendan Miller's got to fight to re-examine a witness who he's just getting new evidence on while the witness is testifying.
No, it's horrible. The conduct that we've seen is I mean, it really just goes to show people how, gosh, what's the nice way of saying this? There's not a nice way of saying it, actually. But the incompetency of the federal government, 100%.
Oh, I don't think they're incompetent. I think they're conniving.
I'd say arrogance.
Yep.
Evil?
Yeah. Well,
Evil.
that too. But
synonymous,
I say that because they, in the same way that they took advantage and so uncaringly stripped 6 million Canadians of their ability to travel and be with loved ones and have their fundamental right of mobility, how they so quickly made the decision that everyone, if you worked at an airport or in a train station or were a federal subcontractor or a prison guard or a park warden, etc., that you had to be vaccinated without any consideration of, if it's a 21-year-old park worker, the risk of the vaccine is far higher than the risk of COVID. So in the same way that the government's been so cavalier about trampling Canadians' rights, that same cultural approach of this Trudeau government we're seeing manifest in the inquiry process in real time on live TV.
Now, is there any sort of, I don't know, anything you can do about that? Like, does the commissioner know that they're giving you these document dumps on the witness while the witness is testifying? Hardly seems fair.
Well, two things happen. One is a judge in any hearing or proceeding, or a commissioner or a tribunal member, will only keep the respect of the room if they treat the parties with respect. So when a party is completely out of line and the decision maker, the person with the authority, does nothing about it, then there's no point in anybody else being in line. So if the Commissioner Rouleau doesn't do something about this, I think he's going to lose control of the room. That's just sort of a practical human nature thing that happens. And you already started to see flavors of it today with the frustration of the lawyers. Yeah. But the other thing that normally happens is that the judge, or in this case, a commissioner, says, all right, well, what do we got to do to make this fair? If you're just getting these documents now, normally what they would do is they would adjourn.
Right.
Automatically. It'd be just an instant adjournment.
I've seen this in regular court cases.
All the time. Somebody tries to bring in a surprise document. Do you want an adjournment? You got it.
Right.
Right. And then there'd be a cost, consequence, and other things. So there'd be an adjournment. And then what would happen is there'd be a rescheduling, and then you'd have an opportunity to re-examine that witness and rely on that documentation. I don't know what he's going to do here. We're in our last week. He's up against a time crunch, but I don't know what he's going to do.
I just think it's so ridiculous. They have entire departments dedicated to getting documents in every ministry.
It's worse than that.
Yeah.
The reason it's worse than that is, of all the parties, who knew first that they were going to have to gather these documents?
Exactly.
The federal government knew on February 14th.
Right.
Because they know, it says right in Section 63 of the Act, within 60 days of invocation or revocation of it, there's going to be a public inquiry, right?
Which they delayed.
But the point is, they knew first about this obligation. They have the largest legal department in Ottawa in terms of law firm. They have endless resources of staff. And so I think it's a combination of tactical to throw us off, to prevent us from having the good stuff, to frustrate us, to muddle us up. And just their sheer arrogance combined with their incompetence.
He's already lost control of the room at that point. And you started to see in the very, very beginning, there was some sort of standard that everyone was setting. People were more respectful, we'll say. There wasn't a lot of objections in the beginning. People were allowed to go. He gave time. I understand that there is a time crunch towards the end of this, but at the same time, you have to equate for the fact that when you have the other half of the room that is receiving all of these documents that no human on this earth can possibly go through, they know these things.
We're watching them read the documents.
Yes, yeah. 100%.
Well, not only that, just to add insult to injury, not that I'm going to get much worse. There's a fair number of the documents that we've been able to go through since I saw you last, seemingly moments ago.
Yeah.
They're illegible and they're undated. So we can't make them out. They're screenshots of text messages, but you can't, they're so blurry and pixelated that we can't tell who they're from and who they're to or what they say.
Another incompetency from the federal government.
You just start to feel like they're playing us all for fools, and maybe they're right. I don't know. I hope not.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And they do have endless resources. They have departments of people that all they do is gather documents when you ask for them.
Yep.
And they've had months and months. They've delayed this once. And now while Bill Blair's testifying, you're getting more of his text messages. It's crazy.
It's sick.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Let's go to clip 3, please, Efron in studio. It's CSIS Director David Vigneault explaining that despite the fact that the convoy didn't rise to the level of Section 2 of the CSIS Act, he told the Prime Minister, you know what? Do her anyway.
Sorry, that threat that you're speaking about is with respect to individuals, but the protest itself did not pose a Section 2 threat to the security of Canada.
What we've testified to is that we did not made a determination that the event itself, and I think it's part of our testimony, yes.
Okay, and yet you still advised the Prime Minister to invoke the Emergencies Act?
Yes, I did.
And you did that not because you thought that there was the protest posed a threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, but because you were reassured that threat to the security of Canada had a different meaning in the context of the Emergencies Act.
I think my testimony was in part that, but it was also based on all of the other information that I became aware of during all of the interdepartmental meetings and cabinet meetings I participated in. So I was provided, that opinion was provided, if you want, as a national security advisor, as opposed to the director of CSIS specifically.
He said, oh, wait, I didn't catch that the first time. He said national security advisor. So that's Jody Thomas.
Right.
We all know how that went. What sort of intelligence could she possibly give to something when she has zero policing expertise? She has no history of anything. She's appointed by Justin Trudeau. That's it. That was the council?
Yeah.
Are you kidding?
Well, and if I'm understanding what happened today, and I think I am, they were never CSIS was never asked to provide a threat assessment on the convoy to cabinet. Did I get that right? They actually, I think, went around CSIS.
No, they provided a threat assessment and all of they provided assessments, whether it's technically a threat assessment or not, I'm not sure, but they provided assessments on 2 occasions.
Right.
They're in evidence, and both of them concluded that there was not a threat to national security.
Which is odd, because why even get an assessment from CSIS if CSIS's assessment is not going to be the assessment you're going to use to invoke the Emergencies Act, which relies on CSIS assessment? Because
that whole line is something they developed in the last week.
Right.
Because they saw all the evidence coming out. Because remember, Mendocino said no fewer than 7 times in the House and various committee meetings that it was the police forces that asked for the invocation.
Right. Yes, that's right.
And once we started having each different police force multiple times testify, wasn't me, wasn't me, wasn't me, they started to run out of field to run on.
Right.
And then when the bureaucrats came in and said, well, it wasn't us, it wasn't us, it wasn't us, they now had to come up with a completely brand new story. So that's why it makes sense. It's because they're fabricating it because they need to. And you really saw it, as I said, when we did one of these sessions after last Friday, that when we had some of the senior officials from the Privy Council's office and the Prime Minister's office testify that they were testing out this new approach, which is, well, it might not have technically met the definition, but we all felt that it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. And we also saw some of the documents, they sort of just breeze by. And a lot of times I'm reading the document, not what they want you to look at, but everything else is probably the stuff you should be looking at. And one of them was that CSIS said that invocation of the act, specifically unnecessarily, would be a thing that would radicalize people to their IMVE status, because it would confirm all the things that people like you and me already think about the government, that it's crooked, it's tyrannical, that it's out to get you, and it's intolerant. And they said, invoking the act is going to push people in that direction. So don't do it if you're concerned about those things. And the government ignored that recommendation because it suited their political agenda.
Yeah, to be clear, CSIS said 2 things in the written documentation from the time, which is in law the most persuasive, not the stuff you make up after the fact when you get your hand in the cookie jar. Right. And it was, doesn't meet the test, no threat to national security. And, oh, by the way, this is probably a bad idea. This could inflame things. That was CSIS's documented position while the protest in Ottawa was ongoing and prior to the invocation. This, the head of CSIS testifying today that, none of the elements were met. The legal tests weren't met. We're clear about that. But I told the Prime Minister it was a good idea anyway. That's all been made up. That's cover for the Prime Minister. Track this gentleman's career and you will see, mark my words, he will be, probably within the next 5 to 10 years, he will be the ambassador to Italy, or maybe the ambassador to Bahamas, or Grand Cayman, or I don't know, maybe France or Germany,
Right. Maybe he'll replace Bill Blair.
Yeah, no,
that's a guy who should be put out
something
to
more cushy.
Now, before we let you go, we'll finish up with the CSIS clips. Apparently, too much time at home on the internet. It's one of the crazier things. I'm like, this is not political. This is just insane. I can't believe these are our security professionals.
Well, I looked over at you and I was like, well, I wonder what happened in the last 2 years to cause people to be inside for such long durations of time. Like, are you kidding?
We've been really tracking the rise of IMVEs since 2020. I'm like, what could have made the people so mad at the government in the last 2 years? I have no idea.
Well, you know what? Being radical, right? Like they accuse other people of being radical, but imposing all these lockdowns and restrictions that are unscientific, that's very radical. So all of of these projections onto other people, calling them misogynist, racist, radicalist, you name it. They seem to house a lot of those traits themselves, don't you think?
It's true. Let's go to, it's clip 4, Efron. Thanks.
Do you have any sort of further comment on that threat environment from 2020 to today? Has it changed in any way, or has it remained the same?
I would say it is increasing, and I'll pass to my colleague as well, but I would, from the CSIS perspective, part of the concern is you're seeing a lot of this type of discussion in more mainstream media. And we know through some of the individuals that we would be concerned with, and as I mentioned a number of times today, they try to use that to recruit individuals towards a more extreme ideology. So because we see a lot more of this globally, frankly, adherence to this type of a movement, it is of increasing concern in terms of the ability for people to access that type of violent propaganda. I don't know if my colleague...
I completely agree. I would also add that we have seen during the pandemic, especially while people were staying home, they spent a whole lot of time on social media, on the internet, and there's surveys that have been done that show a large increase in the number of people researching internet sites that have IMV content. So we have seen that trend. We have seen also the number, as is written in this summary, the number of threats targeting public officials, politicians have been increasing also quite.
Ben Bankus joke. That's literally a Ben Bankus joke. You lock everybody up inside, you legalize weed, and then you wonder why they become conspiracy theorists. What's wrong with these people? They seem puzzled why everybody's mad at the government the last 2 years.
You know, I was just waiting for them to like look over and be like, yeah, they probably listen to Rebel News too. I was just going to be like, that's right. 100%.
Going to alternative news sites.
Yeah, it's really shocking, isn't it? I mean, again, just it's so common sense and it's so blatant and it's so obvious that what they're saying makes no sense. Anyone would be able to discern the truth in that room, even if you were blind, deaf, and dumb for,
They're
100%.
so good. Like these security professionals are so good up until they have to be critical of the government. And then all of a sudden they're completely politically compromised.
Yeah, because when they do their job honestly, they do their job well.
Yeah, like he accurately used the word violence properly. Like violence was actually physical instead of a feeling that Steve Bell had one day on the streets. And they seem really good up until they have to pin the blame on the government. And then they say, no.
100%.
Yeah. And we can't lose sight on the seriousness of all this. And I know you're alive to it. And it's that this power has only been used when there's been a World War, World War I, World War II, FLQ crisis with bombings, kidnappings.
Not even for 9/11.
Not even for 9/11. Not even for many other things. And the definition, I just looked at it again, right in the Act. A public order of urgency means an emergency that arises of threats to the security of Canada. And threats to the security of Canada has the meaning assigned by Section 2.
Yeah.
So we've had evidence after evidence, even again from CSIS again, that the definition wasn't met. But they come right out and say it's still okay because the Prime Minister and some of the people around him thought it was a good idea to strip Canadians of their rights, presumably because the Prime Minister was mad because he was being embarrassed. If we have now transitioned into a country where a Prime Minister can freeze your bank account and strip you of your fundamental rights, override provincial jurisdiction because he's upset, we're in a very dangerous place in this country. So the inquiry's not over. There's still more to do. There's also judicial reviews are going on, but Canadians need to take this very seriously.
I think more people are becoming engaged. I think
so too.
Too. I've seen online, and take that for what you will, but more people who are sort of like, I didn't like the convoy, but I also don't like what's happening here.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing, even the government's own polling has shown that the largest grouping of people is people who are upset and fundamentally unnerved by the idea that the government can at a whim freeze their bank account and seize their money. And even those who were completely opposed to the convoy, fully supportive of mandates and vaccination requirements, fell into that category. So that's encouraging, but it remains to be seen as to whether there's going to be any political accountability here. It's going to be a wild week as we have more politicians come forward. And I know you're going to now start talking about the political angle because we had our first cabinet minister today.
Yeah. Yeah. We have Mendocino tomorrow, right?
That's right.
I'm looking forward to how wrong Brendan Miller gets his name. And by the way, Brendan Miller should check his bank account. I bet it's frozen.
Yeah, probably is frozen.
The terrorism he committed on Bill Blair today.
Yeah. Oh, he got Millered hard. That was great to watch. Absolutely.
We will talk about that. But let's, Efron, if you're watching, and I'm sure you are because you're in the control room, hopefully, can you run an ad so we can let Keith leave the set without tripping in a tangle of earphones? Thank you.